Welcome to this year's Barclay Lecture. This is a very important event in the annual cycle of lectures in Green Templeton College, as it was for Templeton College before it and the Oxford Centre for Management Studies before that. It's made possible by the generosity of the Barclay family in memory of Clifford and Evelyn Barclay. You will all be familiar with the history and know that Clifford Barclay was one of the key figures in the founding of OCMS 50 years ago. Clifford's legacy has been continued by his son Stephen, one of our governing body Barclay Fellows, and his wife Jane, and we are immensely grateful to them for this. In addition to this annual lecture, the family also generously support a Barclay Scholar in the college each year. The Barclay Lecture has been delivered over the years by a number of very eminent speakers, including Eddie George, David Rowland, Charles Handy, Tom Burke, Stuart Rose, Richard Lambert, Bill Castell, Richard Frank, Peter Tufano, and last year Dame Helen Alexander. This evening's lecture will address some of the most important challenges for management that we face in this complex and changing world. And we are delighted to welcome His Eminence Cardinal Vincent Nicols to deliver this year's lecture. The Cardinal has an illustrious career in the Catholic Church, starting with his ordination almost 50 years ago in 1969. As you can see from the programme, his career spans pastoral, administrative and political tasks within the Church and more widely. He's served as priest in a number of different parishes, though he is perhaps much more widely known now for his work nationally and internationally, which includes a very long list of responsibilities and appointments, and an increasingly public profile as commentator and speaker. In 1984, he was appointed General Secretary of the Bishops' Conference in England and Wales, and in 1989, moderator of the Steering Committee of the Council of Churches for Britain and Ireland. Throughout the 1990s, the Cardinal was appointed to a number of important bodies, including the Joint Commission on the Council of European Bishops' Conferences, and in 1998 became chair of the Catholic Education Service. In 2000, Bishop Nicols was appointed Archbishop of Birmingham, and in 2009 he was installed as the 11th Archbishop of Westminster and President of the Bishops' Conference of England and Wales. Just over a year ago, in February last year, he was created Cardinal by Pope Francis and appointed to the titular church of the Most Holy Redeemer and St. Alphonsus in Via Merulana in Rome. He's known and loved across both the Catholic Church and other churches more widely. He's also a highly respected and astute spokesman for the power of business to create a better society. We could have few better qualified to talk to us about how to integrate the interests of business and management with the fundamental values and challenges of a good and strong society than our speaker today. And what an important challenge. We're all looking forward to what he has to say today under his title, Management, Where Next? Challenges and Responsibilities in a Changing World. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Cardinal Vincent Nicols.
Thank you very much for those kind words of welcome. And I can only say it's an honour and a privilege for me to have been invited here today at this important event marking the 50 years of management studies in Oxford. You may still be wondering why I have been asked to give this lecture. I have been wondering why I accepted. But nevertheless, I'm delighted to be here because we are at a fascinating moment when there is striking and growing interest in the business world in what faith and the philosophical traditions can offer to 21st century management. In the next 20 minutes or so, by drawing on that source of wisdom, I would like to take a look with you at some of the key challenges faced by managers today, at some of the underlying issues, and hint at some ways forward for dealing with them. Those of you involved as students, teachers, and researchers in management will spend a lot of time thinking about those challenges and what to do to support managers in responding to them in new, effective, and innovative ways. However, there is a level of analysis that is mentioned less often in academic papers and business school curricula, but which is attracting increasing recognition as crucial. And this is the level of fundamental existential questions, those which are at the same time the most important and the most difficult to answer. They include questions such as, well, what is business for? Why go to work? What are the good life and the good society? How does business contribute to them? Now maybe, though I suspect not, this type of question may have seemed beyond the ambit of management specialists until very recently. But after the effects of the financial crisis and the need to rethink things from the ground up, these questions are no longer the preserve of philosophers or even cardinals. They are very much, I think, the stuff of the work of managers and business schools. In the year 2009, the Pope at that time, Pope Benedict XVI, published a major document entitled Caritas in Veritate. Its focus was human development. It had been due 2 years earlier, but its publication and completion was delayed in order to take into account the effects of the financial crisis and to reflect on them. When it was published, I was contacted by Brian Griffiths, Vice Chairman of Goldman Sachs, who said to me, "This is the best analysis of the financial crisis that I have read. You should do something about it." I think he meant the encyclical, not the crisis. Now that phone call was for me the beginnings of an engagement and dialogue with the business world in the UK, which has lasted since then. And it was this that gave the impetus to the initiative I think you've been hearing about, known as the Blueprint for Better Business. Drawing on that experience and Pope Benedict's documents itself, I would like to focus on 3 of the key insights that he gives into the challenges facing business and society today. Firstly, a word about the critical issues that Caritas in Veritate identified for managers: inequality, corruption, overtly restrictive protection of intellectual property, competition not only between businesses but also between states in a kind of race to the bottom, embracing real hard-hitting reductions in welfare provision. The collapse of earlier forms of solidarity between working people and the rise in their exploitation. The loss of cultural diversity in the face of global patterns of consumption based on the promotion of global lifestyles. Much of the encyclical praises positive developments in wealth creation, but the Pope did not shy away from pointing out clearly these negative aspects. For instance, in regard to inequality, he noted that the world's wealth is growing in absolute terms, but inequalities are in the increase. In rich countries, new sectors of society are succumbing to poverty, and new forms of poverty are emerging. You don't need me to say that global inequalities have not improved much since 2009. And even here, the Office for National Statistics has shown recently that more than a third of the UK population dipped below the poverty line for more than a year between 2010 and 2013, even if we do have better records on level of persistent poverty than most of the countries. So these are some of the challenges. Secondly, Caritas in Veritate called for, and I quote, a further and deeper reflection on the meaning of the economy and its goals. And this is where some of those existential questions I mentioned above enter in. Sometimes people involved in business seem to want to avoid them and treat their businesses as if they were machines or technically driven artifacts, instead of what they actually are, a complex network of human beings collaborating together towards the realization of shared goals. On the one hand, this reluctance is understandable because we all try to make life as simple as possible. On the other hand, this response seems to be driven more by ideological concerns, what we think we should do, given our theories and our way of seeing the world, driven by that rather than by the wide reality of the situations we face. And thirdly, Pope Benedict made a stunning claim that has perplexed a lot of business people and economists. Again, I quote, "The great challenge before us, accentuated by the problems of development in this global era, and made even more urgent by the economic and financial crisis, is to demonstrate in thinking and behavior not only that traditional principles of social ethics like transparency, honesty, and responsibility cannot be ignored or attenuated, but also that in commercial relationships, the principle of gratuitousness and the logic of gift as an expression of fraternity can and must find their place within normal economic activity. This, he concluded, is a human demand at the present time, but it is also demanded by economic logic." It's revealing that this particular part of the text caused so much consternation. I would argue that this insight is fundamental to addressing the financial crisis at its root. The text argues that the logic of gift, the importance of gratuitousness, which we could also call kind of freely given generosity, something given freely without necessarily expecting a return, a kindness towards others, that this is not only a human demand, but also a demand of economic logic. What the Pope is hinting at here is our current way of thinking about the human person in economics, that this way of thinking damages the economic results we obtain, and that our current way of thinking was partly responsible for the crisis that we're in, because it ignores the aspect of human existence that is generous, that is kind for its own sake, precisely in economic dealings. He does not say that we do not need competition or market mechanisms. The rest of the encyclical makes it very clear that he sees the necessity of both. But what he is saying is that we need to recognize another complementary dimension to human identity and action in economics. Not only competition, but also cooperation. Not only trade-offs between individual objectives, but also shared achievement of shared objectives. Not only achieving my own personal good, but also working together with others to produce our common good. This is the insight at the root of the Blueprint of Better Business initiative, and I think the reason why it is attracting interest. In order to unpack this a little further, let me digress for a moment and say a few words about an important article with which you well may be familiar, published in 2005 by Sumantra Ghoshal, entitled "Bad Management Theories Are Destroying Good Management Practices." Ghoshal argued that through a combination of a kind of pseudoscience and a negative view of the human person, management theorists, whenever their theories actually influence practice, had succeeded in creating the very opportunistic, greedy, untrustworthy people that their theories were supposed to control. Ghoshal makes the crucial point that people are not like atoms in a gas. Their behavior is affected by the way they are treated by their managers, which in turn is influenced by the theories these managers use to guide their behavior. So if managers think that their people are likely to take advantage of any situation for their own benefit, against the good of the firm or the shareholders, they will tend to treat their staff with suspicion, thus generating that very untrustworthy behavior they were trying to suppress. Ghoshal goes on to say that by propagating ideologically inspired amoral theories, business schools have actively removed from their students any sense of moral responsibility. Of course, this conference today is witness to the fact that he can't possibly have had Oxford in mind. Now, Ghoshal tragically died shortly before this article was published. It was finished by his son and some colleagues. In it, he pointed to what he believed was needed. We need, he said in a lovely phrase, a scholarship of common sense, with a realistic anthropology as its starting point. So Ghoshal and Pope Benedict agree on the central point at issue here. The very heart of the problem is the fundamental question of what it is and means to be human, and the urgent need to articulate a more realistic and comprehensive view. So what might this more realistic view be? At the present time, the view we take starts and often ends with the fact that we are individuals. As embodied individual beings fixed in time and space, we constantly seek to satisfy our individual needs and desires, including, of course, desires for the higher goods like prestige, status, and power. In this effort, we are inevitably in competition with others, especially when those goods are in short supply. Of course, this stimulates us to do better, and is itself, in itself, is good and important. But it can, and I think we can see it does, lead us logically to assume that relationships with others are also aimed at satisfying individual goals. Relationships, therefore, are best seen as contracts with competing interests, constrained not only by custom, but increasingly by law and regulation. A more realistic view of human nature, with deep roots in Greek philosophy and the Christian tradition, does not deny the place of self-interest and individuality, or indeed the importance of law and regulation. But it recognizes that there is another dimension that operates within every person, our need and desire for relationships of meaning and belonging with others. We grow in freedom through such relationships, which help us to achieve our potential. And in doing so, we create with others common goods, such as friendship and trust, which only come into existence through the commitments we make to one another. And these are truly common goods. They are not divisible and they are not owned by anybody. Much modern research, I believe, confirms what the wisdom traditions of old have taught. Some argue that cooperation is bred into us, such that Richard Dawkins, in the foreword of his 30th anniversary edition of The Selfish Gene, admitted that in the light of more modern research, a good alternative title for the book would have been The Cooperative Gene. These twin aspects of our being human, being an individual and being in relation, operate in all aspects of our lives, at home and at work, with friends and with customers. Just as the simplest explanation we can give of light is that it is both a wave and a particle, since we cannot explain the results we get from experiments with light without adopting this wave-particle duality. So we human beings also need to be modelled as a duality. We are all both relational and individual. This view of the human person, linking the individual with the relational, the objective with the subjective good, technical competence with moral judgment, can provide a more realistic and a more effective basis for management theory. There is an important opportunity here for universities and business schools. And this, as I say, is the anthropology at the core of the Blueprint for Better Business, now an independent movement, a trust, supported by a good number of very experienced managers, as helpful in redirecting management after the financial crisis. And it certainly has my full support. In conclusion, let me recall the famous line of T.S. Eliot. The greatest treason is to do the right thing for the wrong reason. This phrase brings us back to the meaning of what we do in management. If we could really take on board that management and money-making are there to promote human dignity and serve not only common goods, but the wider and true common good itself, we would start doing what we need to do as managers, which includes, of course, being efficient and effective. We'd be doing them for the right reason. And this would help to rebuild the trust between business and society. I would suggest that this could lead to a transformation as profound as the one wrought by the Benedictines over the first millennium. The Benedictine tradition managed to change fundamentally the general view of manual work, which up to that point had been despised in the classical period as something for slaves. Rather, they dignified work, turning it into a source of human development and a form of praise of God. Without this transformation, the Industrial Revolution and the massive increase in living standards that it permits would never have been possible. What could be possible if we could really take on board a view of the human person that allows us to see how cooperation and competition work together, how the human person is designed to serve the common good in cooperation with others in order to achieve personal goals and goods. Adopting in our theories a more realistic view of the human person could release untold energies and innovations that are unthinkable for those of us caught up in the world of trade-offs between self-interested preference maximizers. The remarkable public reaction to the pontificate of Pope Francis and his constant encouragement to us to turn away from, I quote, an economy that kills, and to recognize our real vocation to business, points to the hunger of people in our time for such a change. I hope and pray that the great institutions of this university, whose 50-year tradition of scholarship and leadership we are celebrating today, will play a key part in bringing this new economy into being. And I thank you for your attention.
Ladies and gentlemen, we cannot do anything but reflect upon the richness of what we've heard, a new view of the work of management and of business schools, the dilemmas or dualities of being human. And as we begin that reflection, I'm going to ask each of our panel members for their reactions and reflections. And I'm going to turn to John Barton first. John.
Well, I've been in business for 50 years or so. And when I started, life was very simple because we didn't think about these things. We had one responsibility, which was to make more money for our shareholders. And that's one part, I think, of the duality, which His Eminence talks about. Today, that is still true. A chief executive of a business makes his reputation by making money for his shareholders. But at the same time, there is another truth now that is much more apparent. Every chief executive that I work with is a human being, not surprisingly, and they are subject to all the forces that modern society places on all of us. Many of the things that you talked about, Father, in your speech, all those pressures are on the chief executive at the same time as this responsibility to make money and, as we businessmen see it, create wealth, which is, I would say, the reason for business. It creates wealth in society, not just for the shareholders, but for the people who work in the business and hopefully for the customers too. I listened at the end of the leadership talk, and they were talking about humanizing of chief executives. Actually, what they were talking about was releasing chief executives to display more of their own humanity. And I can tell you from the people that I work with in business, they all believe in a better society. They do not believe in equality or corruption or reduction of welfare or less cultural diversity. None of them. They would like that. They have the pressure on the other side of making money, and they have to make that awful balance. Now, the good thing, I think, about better business is it introduces to businesses society's way of looking at business. And we have to learn more about, as businessmen, what society thinks, because we have to deal with that. Surprisingly, society thinks we should do more of what we think is right, because the views of business people are no different from the views of the population. And I think we are today much further down the road than you might like to think. In the businesses I work in, I see every day things that recognize what society wants us to do. Next, we go to factories in far-flung parts of the world, and we try to improve the conditions there. We're like missionaries, and we have an action plan to do it. We are very attentive to our customers and to the people that work for us, much more than in the past. We talk to each other, we develop things together. Business is moving and it is changing, but it's not recognized yet, I think, in the world, and we have to do more. But I think what Better in Business does is it gives us a clear understanding of what society expects from us. I'll finish with just a little story, if I may, of where business starts from. There's a film, many of you won't have seen it, because it's the Lego film. You may have taken your children or your grandchildren to see it. But in the Lego film, like all animated films, there's a force for goodness and a force for evil. The force for goodness is the little Lego guy, needless to say. The force of evil is Lord Business. So we start to teach our children at an early age, this is a bad place to be. This is not good for business. It doesn't help business in any sense at all, and it certainly doesn't help society. So I would finish by saying we support better in business. It's what we all want to be. And I don't think you find that there are many businesses who would resist the principles that you talked about today, Father.
John, thank you. Tracey, indeed. Oh, right. Thank you, John. Thank you. Let me turn to Tracey Camilleri. Your reactions and reflections from your perspective.
Thank you. Well, as I was listening to the Cardinal and his call for more existential questions, I thought of my own experience on the Oxford Strategic Leadership Programme, which I have been lucky enough to be director of for 5 years, inheriting from Marshall. And there are many people in this audience who are alumni or who are faculty on the programme or tutors, and thinking about what we do to support the agenda that you described, and also what more we could do. And 3 things came to mind. I mean, one was that we provide a place for non-trivial conversations. That seems an obvious thing, but I think in Oxford we are peculiarly hardwired for the sort of probing, questioning, analysing. It comes from our educational philosophy. It comes from the tutorial. I mean, I think we're less good at sort of statement and dogma and telling people how it is, and that that ability to, that convening power that's been talked about today, to bring leaders together and actually to provide an opportunity for that kind of really deep thinking, to have long thoughts, to step out of the stampede is an important part of what we do. And that tutorial idea is very much the kind of mainspring of the leadership programme that I direct, and many others as well. The second thing, the word lens has been used a lot today, and I think that one of the things we have an advantage here at Templeton outside Business School is being in this university. And one of the things I think, building on that idea of conversation, is enabling leaders to come here and look at their challenges and their problems and what they're grappling with through different lenses. We work with philosophers, we work with psychologists, we work with zoologists on this programme. Leadership is practice as well, business is practice, with theatre directors. We had a blacksmith and furnaces last year, really looking at problems through the different language, disciplines, perspectives, and walking around them and enabling leaders to step into the shoes of the other and look back at what they're grappling with. And then the third thing, I think, and it's been talked about before, is this Oxford expertise in the humanities. And you talked about, this question of what is it to be fully human? And, you talked about dignifying work. In some ways, I think we have a role in dignifying leadership as well. It's a particularly hard time to be a leader. We've just been through an election here. And actually, I noticed on the panel I attended before, the entrepreneurship and ethics one, 3 of the panel members used this phrase sea change. That comes from The Tempest, and I would argue, if you're going to talk about leadership after the financial crisis, after the storm, there are extraordinary lessons or provocations that you can get from a play, that you can get from being with a conductor, with a choir in a chapel in Oxford. we work with artists, with art historians, and that the humanities are, repositories for great wisdom and great stories that can help leaders in this sort of quest for purpose, and not necessarily give them answers, and it sounds a very Oxford thing to say, but enable them to leave with new questions. And perhaps that's one of the things that we can help most with here.
Thank you, Tracey. Indeed. Peter Tufano, your reactions and reflections.
Oxford meetings start with a certain formula, and the first item in the formula is conflicts of interest. So let me disclose in advance. So I have attended Blueprint for a Better Business dinners. We're hosting Blueprint for Better Business dinners. Blueprint was in our classrooms this week. So there won't sadly be much daylight between our positions, Your Eminence.
Could I say they were also in one of my businesses this week?
Excellent. So, and picking up where Tracey was, we see ourselves at the business school as not separate from the rest of the university, and hence these kinds of questions are particularly normal. So you had said 50 years ago the way that business was thought of. I want to take it back 100 years ago. 100 years ago, when they were describing in the very first business schools what the purpose of a business school was, they used quaint language, and the language was to teach people how to earn decent profits decently. That's an old phrase, earn decent profits decently. And the concept of decent and decently and decency is a concept that I think, as an economist, doesn't appear in very many economics textbooks. Because economics is, by and large, I don't want to say value-free, but these questions about distribution, these questions about fairness, or might I say justice, are not questions that are primarily in the province of economics, and economics has largely taken over the teaching in business schools. So how is it that you step away from that and think about what decently means and decency means, and do that in this environment? Well, one way to do it is to engage with Blueprint for a Better Business, and the underlying concepts of human dignity and flourishing and the Catholic social teaching are one route into that. A simpler route, or another route, is to take some of the ideas that come from other either faith traditions or other philosophical traditions. I'll offer one, which I think gets to the same point, but in a different path. And it starts with the old simple parents' trick, is if you have two children and one piece of cake, what do you do? And the classic solution, if you're a parent, is let one child cut the cake and let the other child choose. Now, as it turns out, the philosophically kind of derivative position about this was made by a man named John Rawls, and something called Rawls' theory of justice. And Rawls' theory of justice would say, not quite the same, but suppose that in step one, instead of cutting a cake, we say, here's all the rights and responsibilities and privileges, and we're going to determine who gets what. Except we're going to do it behind what's called a veil of ignorance, which is that we don't know where we're going to be put down in that world. We might be put down rich or poor, we might be put man or woman, we might be in Sudan, we might be in the UK. And in the second phase, we have to be willing to be plucked anywhere in the world, and we would be content with the society we found ourselves in. And this is Rawls' theory of justice. Could that work for business? And I would suggest, here's a thought experiment. Suppose that we arrived in a car park one morning, and we don't know when we arrive whether we're going to be an employee or a customer. We don't know whether we're going to be a lender or a shareholder. We don't know whether we're going to be a next-door neighbor that's going to be kind of having to listen to the production or bear the pollution. And all we said in advance is, not knowing which of those roles we're going to have, let's set up a set of rules that say what we would expect to happen. And then in the second step, hypothetically, we would be stuck in whatever role we find ourselves. Now, it's very hypothetical. On the other hand, I don't think it's terribly far-fetched either, because all of us have all of those roles. Everyone in here is a consumer. Everyone here is an inadvertent bystander in a business. Many of us are investors in businesses. Some of us lend in businesses. I think virtually all of us are employed. So using this thought process, what would the set of rules be like where we'd set up what kind of fair engagement would be like, what justice would look like for business? I don't think it starts from the same principles of human flourishing. It probably, however, gets to the same place. So going to traditions like this, whether they're faith traditions or whether they're philosophical traditions, or whether they're just discussions which Oxford loves so much about words like decency. I think there are many ways into this conversation. It's really important that we have this conversation. As Dean of the Business School, I'm committed to this conversation, and there are many things that we've done at our school and hope to do even more to make sure that these topics are dealt with fully, openly, and critically. So I think I'll stop there, and to, again, thank the Cardinal for his comments.
Thank you. So thank you, panel, for a range of very rich responses. I am in a moment going to offer you the opportunity to ask questions or indeed to give us your own response. I'll probably give the final word to you if there's anything you wish to say. But just before we do that, the Blueprint initiative has been talked about quite extensively. Let me just give Charles a very brief opportunity, if you will. Charles Wookey is the CEO of the initiative. Just say a little bit more about it, if you will, for those of us who could do to know a little more.
With pleasure. Thank you very much. So Blueprint for Better Business is a young charity. Its purpose is to challenge business to be a force for good by being successful through living out a purpose that serves society and respects the dignity of people. And what it's done over 2 years, a group of business leaders got together. You heard the story from the Cardinal of how it actually started with Brian Griffiths. But from that, in 2012, a bunch of business leaders got together concerned about the breakdown of trust between business and society. And their point was that actually what was needed was something that came from society rather than from business, that anything business did would be seen to be self-serving. And that there were these bodies of thinking that had a richness of thought and insight to offer to the contemporary problems that were there. So this group set to work to do that, looking at the question of business purpose and also drawing on the thinking and the anthropology which the Cardinal referred to, but also not just from Catholic, but also from other faith traditions and philosophical traditions, going back to Aristotle, thinking about the formation of character, thinking about the human person as both individual and relational. And after a year, we worked one piece of paper. It took 9 months to write it. We had a conference in 2012. One of the CEOs who spoke at that, Paul Polman, said to me at the end, he said, "This piece of paper is really interesting, and I'd like to work with you and the group to see whether we can turn this into something that a business like us would use." So we then spent a year working with Unilever, Vodafone, and a number of other firms, and ended up with what we call the 5 principles of a purpose-driven business. And then the question is, well, okay, that's interesting, but how do you actually make it happen? And the thought then was, don't be a kite mark, don't be a compliance body, don't be something that comes from the outside in, but offer this free to businesses as something, as someone described it to me, it's something that can be like a laptop with Intel inside. It's a way of framing and conceiving business conversations and a challenge both about the quality of relationships, bearing in mind, as you rightly said, Peter, the human being in all the contexts in which we come into, that businesses come into contact with people, thinking hard about purpose and the clarity of purpose, which both provides profitable activities over time, but also provides a way in which the business has a very good answer to the question, why are you here, in terms of a good license to operate. So that's the essence of it, but it's not a judge, it's not a compliance body, it's a movement. And I think one of the things that business leaders are being attracted to by it is that they see, in many ways, it's possible to do something in your own business, on your own, like this, and many businesses have. There are some very powerful, well-developed businesses that have got a very strong sense of purpose and a deep sense of humanity at the core of what they do, and they're profitable. But what is difficult to do for any one business by itself is to change the conversation in society about the place of business. And one of the things that people see in this is a way in which you can gather around. It doesn't give answers, this. But what it does do is frame the questions that business leaders need to ask themselves and can ask themselves. And by being part of this movement, can say, we want to be held to account by society by reference to these. We like the way in which this is conceived of what we're here to do. We think it is what we're here to do, as you were saying, John. And I think that in that way, over time, and the test will be when businesses start talking about the impact it's having and what they're doing differently as a result of it, which was the first question I was asked when I went to talk to the Financial Times about it. They said, we want to see businesses talking differently about what they're doing as a result of something like this. I think that will happen. In fact, I've got some wonderful stories which are not yet public about things that have already happened. So we're very confident that this can help. But it's about businesses wanting to do it. So if anybody here is interested, I'd be delighted to tell them more. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you. Yes. Thank you. So we have a few precious minutes for your comments and questions for the Cardinal or indeed members of the panel or both. Yes, one there.
Good afternoon. David Fu from Hong Kong. I studied engineering, economics, and management at Templeton College from 1984 to 88. Now, the Cardinal just gave a purpose for the next, perhaps 50 years of management education here at Oxford. I see that in pragmatic terms being social responsibility. Now, teaching management with social responsibility in mind, I think will help set the vision for Green Templeton and also Said Business School for the next 50 years. I think that should complement and supplement what I just heard this afternoon, which in simple terms is extrapolation of what Said Business School and Green Templeton are doing, and perhaps because there's sufficient and certainty of funding. So perhaps for the next 50 years, think about adding social responsibility in mind. That's what I said.
Thank you. You've absolutely done what we set out at the beginning of this conversation to do, to try to articulate some themes that will play strongly in the next 50 years. Let me take 2 or 3 other questions and then give the Cardinal a chance to respond. Up in the middle, at the back. And then the next one is there. Thank you. Let me take these 2 and then give you a chance to respond.
Thank you. Michael Smeets here from Green Templeton College, actually. I was intrigued by the Cardinal, but also John. So obviously, Goldman Sachs likes to be informed by papal encyclicas, and most CEOs we work with like to do good through business, which reflects the findings of our CEO report. So my question then, who is it, if the banks want business to do good, not just well, but good, if CEOs want to do good, who is it that we still need to convince that business actually is good? And what's holding us back?
Great question, thank you. Let's just take one more in the middle here. Yeah, the microphone is coming along to you, sir. There you go.
Sandy Wilkinson. Just 2 quick questions. One is on responsibility to the planet and the future. Didn't hear much of that in the talk today, and issues of climate change and what we're leaving to our children and grandchildren. Second question, should business leaders be more ready to engage in public debate? And sometimes they're shy about it, and then when they do, they get shouted down. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
So, Cardinal, I've set you a bit of a challenge. 3 questions. Would you like to respond to some or all of those?
I'll try. Well, the first thing I would like to say is I am an absolute expert at dividing a cake into 5 equal portions. I can do it with unerring accuracy. That was exactly the way we were taught at home. I think the phrase that I've heard, which probably echoed most deeply within me, was the phrase dignifying leadership. I think everybody in a leadership position today, and it's certainly true of bishops, priests, cardinals, as well as business leaders, knows that sense of vulnerability, of the likelihood of being challenged and criticized, fairly or not, but it's a daily expectation. And the task of dignifying leadership, I think, is quite challenging in the practice that we'll have to follow, but also demands some very clear thinking. I think, for the most part, leaders are criticized for both being self-seeking, and people will look at levels of remuneration, and for being self-defending, so they're not open to criticism, defending a closed system, whatever the system might be. And it strikes me that there are 2 key things that need to be done, and in a way they're both expressed in many of the comments this afternoon. But the first is to clarify and enunciate and maybe reshape a fundamental sense of purpose for the institution, whatever that might be. So in terms of the church, for example, it's not sufficient for me in wanting to dignify the role of a church leader. It's not sufficient for me to say, look at all the good we do, look at all the food banks we run, or whatever. social responsibility programs aren't enough. It has to go deeper. It has to go to a convincing statement of a fundamental sense of purpose which is clearly and evidently serving the common good. So, part of my argument, for example, would be to say to people, I would like to engage with you about whatever aspect of Catholic teaching, because I think it's true. Now, I don't think it's true because it's Catholic. I think it's Catholic because it's true. So I have to be prepared to turn the argument round and make myself vulnerable and available on the basis of what is good for humanity. And I think the second thing that is crucial, alongside that sense of enunciating a sense of purpose which aligns the institution for the common good, is the quality of relationships. And for me, the most important aspect of leadership to which I give most attention is the quality of relationships that I have with the people with whom I work, on whom I depend, and who, in a different kind of institutional sense, would be my representatives and leaders in all sorts of different places. And the relationships with those has to be one of trust. It can't be one of suspicion. It has to start from the assumption of a shared goodwill, a shared sense of purpose, and then I think I've got a chance of winning a bit of dignity back, even as a leader. I think the question about who's against all of this, if we're all in favour, let me just tell you very briefly, after Brian Griffiths came to me, he said, I'll get some chairmen of banks together. Please invite them and create for them a setting in which they can talk freely, a setting in which the shareholders or regulators or whatever else weren't present, where they could just express their anxieties right at the front of this crisis. Now, there was one person who was invited who was a former chief of staff of the British military. And after we'd had some opening comments, he asked the first question. And he asked the question of the chairman of one of the banks. He said, how can you be sure that your discussions in a boardroom, your decisions in a boardroom, influence the actions of the traders on the trading floor? And of course, the chairman couldn't answer because he couldn't do it. He didn't know how, right through an organization, a view that he might have could actually be put reliably into practice. Because the further down, certainly the finance industry you go, the stronger those drives for immediate profit, where the questions are simply, is it legal, is it profitable, then we'll do it. All of the considerations put to one side under the speed of reaction. I met a chap the other day, and he's in computer technology, and his job on the trading floor was to get the tiniest fractions of seconds out of the speed of the transaction from the desk to the computer. Now, that mitigates against all that we're talking about. So the forces, if you like, that are not aligned to these intentions are very real, and they are very important for the competitive side of what we're talking about. But if this is going to flourish into, hopefully, a new economic era, then those issues have to be engaged as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Sadly, we don't have time for any more questions, but I have no doubt that this conversation and this reflection will continue. As is traditional, at the end of the Barclay lecture, I would like to invite Stephen Barclay to conclude it.
Today has been a very exciting and stimulating day as we celebrate OCMS at 50. It's great to meet up again with old friends and colleagues and share memories. I've been asked by several people today, how did it all begin? Well, it all began in the early 60s when my father, who had been a practicing accountant and entrepreneurial financier, was asked to be a substitute speaker at the Oxford Business Summer School. So there was a bit of luck and a bit of opportunity, not a lot of science. And he met there with Norman Leyland, George Richardson, John Wright, and Laurie Baragwanath. And they'd all sort of had an ideal to start a business school at Oxford. And that appealed to my father, who left school when he was 16, become an accountant, and sort of had, as many people do, the thought he'd like certainly his children and others to have better education. And so he said, I'll put some money in to help start up what became the Oxford Centre for Management Studies. But who would have imagined 50 years ago, when OCMS opened its doors in the Woodstock Road under the stewardship of Bill Impey, who I saw today, that the Acorn would have spun out into a world-renowned business school and a major graduate college at the UK's leading university. I was privileged to be involved, albeit marginally, when I was in short pants as a trustee of the Barclay Oxford Trust, which my father used to fund the early stages of OCMS, and so give Norman Leyland and Norman Chester the opportunity to bring business to Oxford. Whilst we have previously honoured the three major founders, the two Normans and my father, when a room was dedicated to them some years ago at Said Business School, however, I think it's still worth reflecting on the achievements of OCMS over the 50 years since, as we enjoy this day of celebration. Many of those who helped OCMS and its successors achieve success are here today. Many, unfortunately, are not. But as many of us know, that success achieved over the years, some good and some bad, because of those involved were part of a team, indeed a family, and enjoyed the tasks. And as the Cardinal said, they trusted one another. The challenges and achievements through working together and creating the successes we have today, we from the Barclay family here today appreciate all that has been achieved and are grateful and appreciative that we've been allowed to be involved in one way or another over the 50 years. As I said, the OCMS Acorn has sprouted the oak trees of SBS and GTC, who have joined forces so magnificently to celebrate today. And I personally like to thank Andrew, Jonathan, Keith, Peter and Ingrid for allowing us to do this. However, we could not be celebrating today without the philanthropic support of four entrepreneurs, Wafik Saeed, John Templeton, Cecil Green and my father. 50 years ago, as UK business schools were founded, it was a new phenomenon. Indeed, Norman Chester was insistent that OCMS kept itself outside of the university clutches. But their success and growth was due to the financial and philanthropic support of these entrepreneurs. And because of this and the growth of philanthropy as an industry, Michael and Earl and I have recently initiated the founding of the Oxford Centre for the Study of Philanthropy here at GTC, and it'll be interesting to see where this develops over the next 50 years. OCMS, as its name states, was a centre for management studies. And while it is initially focused on the business sector, it was recognised that management skills and leadership were needed in many sectors, be it healthcare, education, government, or other services. And it follows many of the objectives and has followed of a blueprint for better business. This theme has been followed both at Said, which has now become a £60 million business, but also at GTC with its activities in research, lectures and seminars in many areas of human welfare, particularly in the last 5 years under the leadership of David Watson. And it's tragic he cannot be here to share the celebration which he originally initiated. The Barclay Lectures started in 1992, when Professor Joe Bauer, a former colleague of Peter Tufano's, came over from Harvard and gave the inaugural lecture. And we've had many distinguished lecturers, as Ingrid pointed out, since then. but we're particularly honoured and privileged that the Cardinal Vincent Nicols has joined us here today and shared with us his thoughts and views. My father, a nice Jewish boy with Polish parentage, would have been very proud, or as they say in Yiddish, would have quelled if he were here listening to His Excellency. The church and religion have, we know, provided significant leadership in education, social welfare, as well as football. Indeed, when we met recently with His Excellency, he shared with us the reason Newcastle play in black and white. So I added to my education. And it's good that in this, the 21st century, our religious leaders, rather than the state, are again setting the benchmarks and intellectual challenges that we face. In particular, a blueprint for better business provokes us to address many particular aspects of business: relationships, respect, values, trust, long-term sustainable performance, as we've heard and discussed this afternoon, as well as fostering innovation and personal accountability. As a result, we can hope that the society as a whole may improve. He has, by sharing his thoughts and philosophy with us, left us many challenges, and some of these were addressed and discussed by Peter, John, and Tracey, and which perhaps give some direction to our theme today: management where next. It also gives us the opportunity to reframe the place of business in society. In fact, we could say in a way it refreshes and confirms many of the principles set out 50 years ago by the founders of OCMS, and so today was given us the opportunity to reaffirm our vows. For this, we're most appreciative of the contribution made both by you, Your Excellency, and also by the discussants, and therefore would like to thank you personally very much for sharing it all with us. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're drawing to the end of this part of our day of celebration, looking backwards and looking forwards. And very shortly, in about less than 45 seconds, I'm going to ask Jonathan Reynolds, the co-chair of the Celebration Committee, to give us some concluding words. But let me seize those 45 seconds to say, I think, three things. First of all, usefully, thank you. 2 words, very important. Thank you for being here. Thank you for participating in a conversation that I hope has stimulated you as much as I've certainly found it very stimulating. Secondly, I hope the conversation will continue and you will stay connected with us. And thirdly, as a token of our thanks, a kind of going home present, as you leave the room, you will find for each of you a copy of the CEO report based on the research that was spoken about both in the plenary session and in the panel session, and that was launched at Davos. So do pick that up if you can. So as I conclude with my thanks to you as panel chair, let me hand over to Jonathan Reynolds to say the final words. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kathryn. And it's been a remarkable few hours. Who would have said that just around about 5 hours ago, we would have started out on a journey that's led to redesigning business schools, thinking about new healthcare systems, challenging notions of entrepreneurship, thinking about a sense of corporate purpose and humanity. By the way, also going through not just the Lego movie, but the Everly Brothers, mole killing, I recall, and as well, I think the sense that women's amateur footballing, for those of you in the panel, only those of you will get it, was actually a sport to be reckoned with. So it's been a remarkable journey over the last few hours. I've learned a great deal. And I just say, if you've returned to Oxford just for today, well, welcome back. I've had some fantastic conversations over lunch and during the rest of the day. And I very much hope that the kinds of conversations you've had this afternoon have resonated with you and have reminded you of how good and intellectually stimulating it was to be here. Indeed, those of you that have been following Twitter, and I know that many of you, of course, will have been doing that simultaneously in listening to the debates today, will have spotted that someone has already tweeted, damn right, it's good to be back. Excellent news. And if you're a local, then I hope we've helped to build a greater appreciation and awareness of some of the things that those working in business and management, whether it's in the business school or here in Green Templeton College, are seeking to achieve. I'd like to think also, to echo Stephen's comments, that the founders and supporters of this enterprise, particularly those we've lost in the past year, would have found our discussions fruitful and worthwhile, and the directions of travel entirely in keeping with and within the spirit of the mission that they foresaw, which they and others have so carefully stewarded over the last half century. I've also been struck by what Oxford, a university of departments and colleges, can achieve when working together with friends and alumni. And that's wonderful to see. It's great to see what can be achieved in half a day. Who's to say what we could achieve in the next 50 years? As Kathryn has said, we'll be giving you a summary report from the conference. But in looking forward, we hope that this conference has inspired you to think about how management studies can develop into the future, and inspired you too to consider what role you might play in helping us to bring that about. So let me close this part of the day with a couple of expressions of thanks. Firstly, I think to Shona Nicholson and her colleagues, both in the college's development and events offices, as well as in the business school's marketing and executive education teams, for their extraordinary hard work in delivering this conference, despite the threat of rail strikes and traffic conditions and so on. I think it's been a great example of collaborative endeavour. Second, to Kathryn, who as an Associate Fellow of the Business School has demonstrated, as we knew that she would, how well and professionally these kinds of events should be conducted. Thank you, Kathryn. And thirdly, this won't be the last time, I'm sure, and he will not be pleased with me for singling him out, I want to thank personally Keith Ruddle. Keith's vision, persistence and calm good humour under fire over the past year has been entirely instrumental in keeping us in focus and on target. And as Kathryn has said, thank you to you all, finally. I hope that, as she said, you felt yourself to be participants and not merely delegates. I hope also that your own participation in the start of these conversations that will continue, that your own participation in the journey of management studies will continue as well. And I think Kathryn's going to say a little more practically about next steps rather than, in principle, next steps in a few moments. But thank you very much indeed for coming.